Hi, everyone. Welcome to our last session of the xAPI Party Cohort Fall 2022 cohort, I guess. You can see it's been a long day. Sorry about that. But this is our last panel session. It will be moderated by Megan Torrance. And Megan Torrance and her team, Torrance Learning, have hosted the xAPI cohort previous to the Guild hosting it, and they have sponsored this fall cohort. And Megan has prepared some questions for this group of panelists. We have Amy Parent, we have David Kelly, and we have Matt. Could you say your last name, Matt?
Yeah, Cleaver.
Cleaver, thank you. And I'm going to turn things over to Megan.
Fantastic. Well, everybody, thanks for joining us for this closing session of the day. The xAPI Party is always just such a fun celebration of what's happening in our space and sharing and collaboration. And I love the Guild's vibe, right? You know, together we are better. And or at least that was one of the vibes at one of the times. And it was just one of those things that really stuck with me as a theme for how our industry is moving forward and sharing and coming together and kind of upping our game with xAPI. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And if you have questions for the panel, go ahead and put them in the chat. I think there's a way to go ahead and do that so that we can be fielding them as they come in. But what I'd like to do is ask the panelists, and I am going to start with, I'm going to go Amy, Matt, Karen, David in that order, and ask you to introduce yourself and what you do in the xAPI space, because you all come at this in a different way.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Amy Parent. I work at Salient Learning. My role in the xAPI space today is Director of Learning Ecosystems. Really, it involves kind of that learning engineering approach, if you will, working with a team of individuals with different skill sets and really trying to pull an infrastructure together, both in people, in design and architecture, and in technology. And xAPI is a huge part of that point of view that we have taken in building all of that. I have, I don't know, I lost count experience as an instructional designer and learning technologist, having started my career as an educational technologist and have evolved from there into the private sector. So that's me.
Very cool. Well, welcome. And you had a great session this morning, I heard. So thank you very much. Matt, how about you? Introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hello, I am Matt Cleaver. I work at Torrance Learning. I'm on the learning engineering team as that definition of that kind of evolves. So I work mostly in doing web development. So Torrance Learning in general, do custom design and development and everything kind of revolving around training. But I specifically work on web development, a lot of xAPI in the last several years, some front end, back end stuff, but yeah, definitely a lot of xAPI. So I think it's Karen next.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I'm next. So many of you may know me from online events because I'm the online events production manager here at the Guild. So my connection to xAPI is I build the back ends and I try and make sure all the presenters are where they're supposed to be for the cohort, as well as reach out to the speakers for the cohort. I do have a background in corporate training myself, as well as custom software development. I was a business analyst. I was not programming, but in my job, I had to learn how to code with HTML. So I know HTML, I know CSS, I understand that. I also needed to know how the databases talk to one another, the middleware and everything else. So I know that kind of component. I know that kind of ecosystem. I'm now taking that knowledge that I have from my previous position and learning about xAPI because, oh, shocker, I'm a newbie to it. So even though I'm here and you think I would know everything, I don't. And so I'm learning just along with all of you, and I'm really excited to learn all of this.
Karen, you know what? Before David introduces, I will say, I think there's only been one xAPI cohort host who actually knew xAPI before they started. So you're actually not the outlier you think you might be.
That's good to know.
I am David Kelly. I am CEO of the Learning Guild. Before I answer your direct question, I'll take the opportunity as panelists here to just say thank you to Megan Torrance Learning, to Matt, to my dogs for interrupting me right now, and to really your entire team for everything that you've done to drive the xAPI cohort, the xAPI conversation in the industry, and for all the help you've given us in this transition to the cohort. So thank you for that. It's also a good transition to my role within this. At the Guild, we're always looking to host conversations that help push the industry forward. And xAPI is a big part of that. It's a big part of the future of what our industry is going to do. It's going to enable a lot of change in our industry, and we're obviously big proponents of that. So we are looking forward to continuing to support through the cohort and other methods the growing conversation and adoption of xAPI within our industry.
Very cool. And your dogs are fascinated by the possibilities.
My dogs have a sensor that recognizes as soon as someone hits a record button in Zoom, they instantly start barking.
And with just a little bit of code, we can send an xAPI statement every single time that happens.
You should try.
That's fantastic. There actually was an xAPI project team that connected up with the Zoom API and was able to convert Zoom activity into xAPI activity. So we can get the dogs barking. We can do this. So Amy, you know, I've known you for years. We met through the cohort, right? Yeah, right. So my question is, right, so coming from the business world, coming from out there, right, what drew you into xAPI as a solution and what keeps you here?
Yeah. Okay, awesome. This is a fun question. So what drew me into xAPI as a solution? I will tell you that I first was exposed to xAPI at my very first DevLearn conference at, I think it was 2016. And I came back from that conference talking all about, anybody heard about this thing of xAPI? xAPI? Of course not. So really what drew me in was the very simple structure of the xAPI statement. And just through that structure alone, you know, Amy watched video, my brain exploded into a million possibilities, because up until then, I only knew basic things that I could get about, you know, how people were interacting with the learning and what they were getting from the learning experience. So that's really what drew me in. And it opened up a whole bunch of ideas about how it could answer a lot of questions and tapped into that innate thing that I have, wanting to understand and learn more. So
Were you a data person, a geek person, a numbers person?
I have a science background. You know, my background is in you know, biology and chemistry and the sciences, and coupled with technology. That was my other half of my skill and background. So which is part of what drew me into instructional design. And then, you know, xAPI just continued to ignite both of those interests in me. Yeah.
That's fantastic. It sounds like you're the picture of the future for people who can't decide what major to have in college.
Yeah,
Right? So a little bit of this and a little bit of this, and I pulled it all together, right?
Right.
So that's fascinating. In fact, Amy and Matt, you both in your introduction mentioned the term learning engineering, and yet learning engineering was a topic we really haven't talked much about in the cohort. We haven't talked much about today in Party. It doesn't get a lot of traction yet. What the heck is learning engineering?
Yeah, so to quote those who are really doing the work in this space, it's more of a process than it is a person. And I think that's important to understand. And it's a process of leveraging a lot of what we already do as instructional designers or data analytics, but bringing it all together as a full practice, right? So some of us, identify as instructional designers, or we identify as educational technologists, or we identify as developers or data analysts. But learning engineering is the discipline of bringing all of that together in an iterative format. So when you hear me say things like, we're thinking about how we're going to measure this while we're thinking about the design and the architecture of it, so that we can design and architect and engineer that in to the experience. So it's kind of collective. That's where I'm at in talking about it today. What about you, Matt?
Yeah, I think it's sometimes a little fuzzy to me, or it's like it's evolving a little bit because it's kind of broad and covers different disciplines. So, there's learning sciences, instructional design, there's the data and analytics part, and there's iterations and all sorts of components of it. So at Torrance Learning, we kind of have the learning engineering team, which involves different people at different times that are required to get the whole end-to-end solution, and it might involve me at the data and analytics part, or, the implementation. And then we have instructional designers and people who have studied these things and are using different methods and, what was the word I was thinking of, but different platforms and things, ways of thinking about how to put these things together. So all of those together are kind of under the umbrella of learning engineering.
It sounded to me, I often think of it, it's similar. Learning experience design kind of levels up or expands on the concept of instructional design, but instructional design is still an essential component of it. And learning engineering to me has a similar vibe. And there's a new book out edited by Jim Goodell on learning engineering. And Craig Pollack just put another interesting title in the chat too. So I'll have to add to my holiday reading list, which is getting thicker and thicker as I go.
Megan, if you don't mind, I think we're having this conversation because I think we're in a place in L&D, where the learning engineering processes and people and skill set is necessary. That one person cannot be all of it, right? It's just too much skill for one person to be able to master. Generalists are needed, but to take it to the next level, we got to have people like Matt and people, like David, and each one of you who have your own unique area of expertise come to the table.
That's where the fun happens.
Yeah.
Right. That's where the fun happens. So cool. Speaking of fun, Karen, you've had the opportunity to listen in on every single xAPI cohort presentation this semester, and you've connected with every single one of the teams doing work in the Slack channel. And I would just, as someone new to this specific named space of it, what's fascinating to you? What's caught your eye?
I like the analytical part of it. I mean, Amy's there smiling because I'm part of an analytical geek as well, because I was a business analyst. So I would listen. It's very similar to what people do. They listen to what people need or what they say they need, and then they figure out what they really need to solve their problem. And then if you need to have that brought back to, did I solve their problem? You need that analytics stuff to figure it out. And this is really much more than, yeah, I finished the course. Yeah, I turned in this. I did that. I also, have some K-12 background. So I understand that. And if you can get those analytics in place, which I saw time and time and time again with all the different cohort presentations, and then I saw the teams were talking back and forth on how they could do things. I think that collaboration of cohort is fabulous. And I was talking with someone else who said, yeah, being in cohort made them focus on actually doing it, because sometimes you can't always do it within the scope of your workday because it's not part of your job. But if you're part of cohort and you make a commitment to other people, you're forced to do it. And to me, that little extra commitment, yeah, people are counting on me, is really important. So if anyone's out there who hasn't been part of cohort and I'm not sure if I can make that commitment, do it, because you will then come away with a lot of knowledge and collaboration. And then you get to be that learning engineer.
Absolutely. And I think, and I've participated in cohort as well as led it, and that accountability and that structure and that community, okay, peer pressure, that's helpful, right? Especially over a long-term project made up of volunteers. It is not an insignificant task to wrangle people volunteering from multiple companies and organizations into one space. So absolutely. So Amy, something that Karen just mentioned reminded me of a story that you've told once around answering those first questions before you get to the cool questions. Do you know the story? Like it was one of your analytics presentations was mentioned that you get asked a question to solve by the business, and even if you don't think that's the most interesting one, you have to go there first to settle that thought. Can you fill in where I'm forgetting here?
Oh, I'm trying to remember, but I mean, if I were to just kind of think about that experience as I have, they always want to know, the main things you want to know is, did they complete it, and did they like it? And while you and I know that doesn't tell us anything about the success of the learning and the impact that the learning has, you have to honor those questions first. And I can't remember the exact story that you're talking about, Megan. I apologize. But I think once you get past that, then you can start to explore, like, well, what else do you want? What else would tell us that answer? What else, would you want to see? How do you know, something's been successful? What would that be like in a question format?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of riffing on you right now. I apologize for not remembering the story.
No, I remember every story you tell, Amy, even if you don't. But I will say that I know that because Matt and I tend to be, I tend to be the waving hands and kind of like, oh, let's do this. And then Matt's the one who partners with me to actually make it happen. That there's been lots of times like, I had this great idea. And then Matt goes and does exactly that. And I come back, oh, that's so cool. So now what I really want is this. And that iterative process is pretty cool.
Yeah, the only story I could think of was that one graph I showed where we answered the basic question, but the question, it actually only led to a bunch of other questions.
Yes,
And I had put a big question mark on the graph and said, why do we see nothing after this point? Like, what happened? And I think that's where people's imaginations actually expand.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question, Megan, to what you just asked, what you were describing. So when you have a big idea and you turn it over to Matt, and he goes and builds it, and then he comes back to you and just, oh, hey, cool, now I want this. Matt, do you describe that as iterative? Is that the phrase that you use to describe that?
That's a kind of iteration. Yeah. Yeah. Well, luckily, rarely does it get scrapped. I don't think we've scrapped anything.
Yeah, of
we have a
course.
lot. We have a lot of things that maybe got left aside, intending to come back to it, never did. But yeah, luckily, there's always some kind of iteration there.
Oh yeah, always learning's in it.
Yeah.
Well, and I do remember the first time that we had, successfully gotten data out of the hands-on museum project. So this project, it's got, kids are wearing Bluetooth beacons that identify, not them as individuals, they're anonymized. So they're all like animals or trees or birds or whatever. And they go up to an exhibit, and there's a tablet next to the exhibit that recognizes the beacon and says, hey, big brown bat, and asks you questions and engages you in that exhibit. And as the student is doing that, all that data is being tracked using xAPI, right? So there's no login required. It's a hands-free login. All of the school science standards are tagged as context within the xAPI statement, so you can cut the data by school science standard, right, Amy? Like, that's cool. And there's like, it's a really cool, and multiple students, because kids come through the museum in groups, right? So they're tracking multiple students interacting at once, right? Which of course our LMSs don't do. So this is, on steroids, really expanding on all the things that xAPI does really, really well. It's a platform that the museum director and I waved our hands around, and Matt actually brought it to life. But I remember when we first got data through that, and I was like, yeah, I'm looking over Matt's shoulder, and we were looking at one of those kind of like those wiggly spider charts, not spider charts, but the network graphs. And I'm like, yes, look at that. And then we clicked again, and it's like, it's not telling us anything interesting.
It was fun to watch it move now.
So, Matt, I've been mentioning this, you and I have been working in the xAPI space together since 2012, 2013. And you have undertaken, through xAPI parties or just random projects, all sorts of really fun edge case prototypes and proof of concepts and random things. Are there like 3 of them that, we spend so much time in the e-learning space talking about e-learning, but are there 2 or 3 of those projects that are really edge case that kind of show the power of what we're talking about with xAPI?
Yeah, and if anybody has been in these cohorts for a while, you've probably seen the presentation that we do sometimes about xAPI from non-e-learning sources. So, and one of our first for the first ADL cohort that we went to, we actually involved a lot of Internet of Things, IoT devices. So that was kind of our impetus and our way in. It's like, we'll do something kind of interesting that's outside of these other things. So being able to connect to the outside world in the physical world when you interact with things, and what are the challenges with that? Like, how do you know who did what? How do you identify who's who? If you're using a badging system, that's easy, but if you're just somebody walking through a door. So we had our conference room door for a while when we were actually in the office all at the same time. Every time it opened and closed, it would send a statement, and it was mostly just to test the sensor and sending a statement. And it was just kind of an interesting use case. But then we also could see some data there. See when is it most active? There was a temperature sensor on there, which is part of the board, but you can see when the room's closed, how does the temperature change? But those are sort of things you could do without xAPI, but it was just an interesting way to kind of capture that data. You could combine that with other data if you knew who was doing what. One thing that we did is, I think it was another xAPI cohort, or no, it was an xAPI party project when we were also in the physical space, where we had kind of a, what do we call it? And when we had everybody gets in the room, what does that even call? It was like a hackathon, but it was basically
Mhm.
where we all got together during the xAPI party, and we just decided on a project and tried to finish it by the end of the party, and then show what we did. And one of those was being able to take a picture of something, send a statement with that image as an attachment. So that actually has a really good practical use case for evidence-based statements where I did this thing, I can prove I'm here, I did this, here's an image of it that's actually attached to those statements. So that was a kind of a cool example. We've done other things like that that don't always necessarily go in a particular direction, but you learn a lot by testing those things out and figuring out what can't you do, what can you do, where could this go.
I'll confess, I sent a picture of a banana using that as an xAPI statement, just because I could. So it was fun, right? But I mean, you then you start thinking, well, what if I sent a photograph of a roster? What if I sent a photograph of a piece of equipment that I assembled or fixed, or a disaster situation, or my location, or all sorts of things, right? So it's these pilots and prototypes and proofs of concept that are pretty cool. So, you know, David, you touched on this a little bit in your introduction, but the Guild has really been a long-time supporter of xAPI since the early days. And at the same time, you follow learning trends. If you go to anybody who goes to a conference and David is speaking on, you know, if he's one of the session speakers on trends, it's a packed room. And can you talk about some of the things that you see with your industry level lens about what's going on with xAPI now, both exciting or maybe troublesome, some or concerning?
Sure. I can briefly speak to both sides of that. On the promising side, I would say xAPI, Amy mentioned that she lost count of how long she's been in this industry. I have not lost count, which is why I'm not going to share how long I've been in this industry. I've been in here for a while. And while the conversation shifts over the tides, over the years, it's always been built around the same limited framework. You know, everything that we do, all the different things that we do, are still built, anything learning technology-wise, have always been built around SCORM, which is very, very limited. And xAPI's introduction is a game changer. I don't mean that as hyperbole. I don't mean that as marketing hype. I mean that in a literal, it has changed the framework upon which everything that we do can be built. It has literally changed the language. It has added complexity that is removing the shackles of the constraints that many of us operate within a very defined box without even understanding how constraining that box is, because it's all we've ever known in terms of the technology that it's built upon. And xAPI has opened the doors to that. And the potential to tell better stories about the effects of what we're doing and have better understanding to make data-informed decisions about what we're doing to support our organizations is truly changing the framework of what our industry can do. And the potential that is out there is why there's so much energy around that. And all the different technologies that we have that are out there, all the different tools, all the different platforms that are out there have still been built upon this limited framework. And those doors have been blown open by this. And that makes it a really, really exciting time, which is why there's so much energy around xAPI. On the flip side, some of the stuff that I think that can hamper that conversation is and this is uniquely through the lens that we have here at the Guild of hosting these conversations. It's real easy to get to hijack the conversation around the how and skip over the why. And I think sometimes that can happen. That there's such an interest in getting under the hood and finding out how to do this really, really cool thing that sometimes we can lose track of well, why are we doing this in the first place? And I love the example that you threw out there a second ago, Megan. If you're doing it right, doing the thing for the sake of doing it proves to you that something is possible, and then you can connect that context to the why. But you've got to come back to the why, not just do things for the case of it. And I think sometimes, even in the feedback we've gotten through this cohort, sometimes people can get overwhelmed because they're getting so quickly pushed down the how do I do this thing path, that they're still trying to get on the treadmill of why. And I think that's been a takeaway from me in terms of the cohort as we manage going forward. Like, how can we help people get on the treadmill before they even get to the cohort even starts? So there's kind of a foundational piece, and I think that's going to be important to support adoption going forward.
Absolutely, because there's only so far you can get with sending pictures of bananas.
I think your point is something that everyone should pause and think about right now, honestly. And I think, Megan, it sets the right transition for the next question.
If you want to ask it and answer it, go for
Yeah,
it.
sure. Which is around, what's something that we don't want people to miss about xAPI. And for me, there's two things. Number one, the learner. I think that comes off of what David was just saying about the why. I see a lot of focus, and it makes sense. It's level one. We focus on what can we get from the data? What can the data tell us? What can xAPI do for me, for my business, for my department, for my boss, right? But I think it's actually, at the end of the day, the learner is a big opportunity and a why for xAPI to stay focused on, and don't miss that. And then the other side of that, again, coming straight off of what you just said, David, for me, the second thing I don't want you to miss is that everybody has a different way to engage and support xAPI. You could be someone who supports and promotes it and continues to open up discussions around data. You could be someone who's under the hood, trying and experimenting and building and showing the possibilities. You could be an instructional designer or a facilitator, trying to support inputs and outputs of data in your architectures and your designs and your discussions. So the learner, and there's a role for everyone. It's not only about the doing. That's just me.
That's why we love you. Anybody else? What don't we want people to miss? Because we've just gotten a whole bunch of people all whipped up and excited about xAPI all day long.
I think, and we talk about it a lot, especially in the cohort, but starting with a small prototype and working your way up, especially if you feel like it's kind of daunting or overwhelming, starting small and testing things. For one thing, it can prove certain things. You might say, oh, this, like we said, you're going down the wrong path, so you can turn around a lot quicker once you're, if you're just starting small. But if you start really big and go, okay, we're just going to implement this all at once, then you might find out you have a whole bunch of data that you can't use, or you got things out in production you can't turn around. You're like, okay, we got this mix of good data, bad data. So starting small and fixing things. And I think about this a lot. I don't know if anybody's an artist or a painter out there, but when I think about this as kind of a metaphor, when you're painting, I don't know if you've ever seen anybody paint something, but they don't just go, okay, I'm just going to start at the top right corner and I'm going to start painting and I'm going to get all the way, go to the bottom left corner. They start with a sketch in pencil, and then you start filling in some blocks, and then you start getting some hues and colors in there. And then, you work in and you work out, you look in and you pull back out. Because if you just started going in and painting an eyeball, and then you go paint another eyeball, when you zoom back out, you might have two eyeballs and off kilter. So you kind of got to do some details and then work back out and look at the whole and make sure that everything is still working, and then just keep going back and forth like that until you get the whole thing that you want to do. So I think working in that prototype and iteration cycle, in general, but especially if you're getting started, just kind of learn some things and then kind of build over time.
I'll add one element to what I had mentioned earlier. to remember that xAPI is not a solution. It's not an endpoint. And I'll put this in a specific context. xAPI is a tool, and how we use it can enable solutions. And as xAPI has risen in terms of its visibility and awareness within our industry, you go to expos like we host, and you'll see different vendors talking about how their tools are now xAPI compliant. Again, that's not a solution. So you have to really ask the question of, what does that mean? Because, and I saw this come through the chat, if you built xAPI into your tool so that it could do exactly what it did in SCORM, you haven't changed anything. And that's, it's a first step, because now you've got it in the framework. But if it never goes beyond there to start making new things, then why bother doing it in the first place? So remember, it's not a solution. And if you're going to bring in third-party solutions to enable this within your organization, ask beyond just, are you xAPI compliant? Ask how are they leveraging it in their tool?
Yeah, I'll just add, it's a tool. I mean, it's just how you use the tool is important. You don't want to be taking a hammer to screw in a screw. You have to be using the tool properly to get the right information. And if you don't want to have so much information that's not meaningful. That's the other thing. You need to use the tool to get the meaningful information, because yes, we all love pictures of bananas, but you can only have so many. And if it's not because you want to create a banana split, if I want to create a banana split, is my banana still good? Here's my picture of my banana. Oh, it's still good. Now that's meaningful data. But if you say, hey, I want to pay accounts payable. Okay, here's my picture of banana. It doesn't make a sense. So you need to have meaningful data.
Well, and Karen, I love that, right? And meaningful data in accounts payable it's not bananas. It's also not hours of seat time in training, right? So meaningful data in accounts payable involve dollars and errors and time and things that are business metrics, right? So I think that's the other piece. We'll naturally gravitate to learning metrics. It's what we're responsible for. Right, it's what we're on the hook for. It's what we have influence and control over, but it's not the end. Even L&D is not the end game. The goal is not to deliver training and track training. Right? The goal is to improve business performance and deliver on the mission. So those are our big components.
Karen, I also would like to just throw in a proactive apology for the volume of your inbox that you're going to see in the next couple of days, as I challenge your assumption of you can only have so many pictures of bananas.
Well, Matt's put 3 here in chat, so
More where that came from.
I will find my xAPI statement and post that out.
And then I will do the same and share that with David.
I love it. I love it. This is fantastic. This has been a wonderful conversation. I have one last question to kind of spin us out for the day. What's something in the xAPI space, it's either here or coming, that you're really excited about? Amy, do you have an answer to that question?
I was waiting for you to ask this question. So I think there's things I'm excited about now, and then there's things I'm excited about because I just see potential and I wonder about opportunity. So the first things that I'm excited about now is actually just over the last maybe 2 to 3 years, the level of adoption across vendors and people. I mean, I know it's still small, but oh my gosh, you guys all know, go 4 years out and it was pretty slim, right? And basic. So I'm pretty excited about that. And to David's point, yeah, we have a starting place, and then we just, now that that's built, we can continue to evolve. The other thing that I'm excited about, which I think has potential into the future, I'm actually excited about the efforts in evolving the sophistication of the specification and how it's actually used. The work in the profile space, those folks who are devoting so much time and effort into doing that, that's going to translate over to the vendors in hopefully a nice, cleaner and easier way. I'm also really excited about how xAPI is starting to play and how it's going to evolve in the AI, the AR, the virtual learning space. So it's kind of coming off those early experiments of the, the Internet of Things, but in new technologies like David referenced, right? And then also how it plays in machine learning and that space. And then finally, its potential to support a new set of adventures in learning sciences. So think big data, think open source databases with de-identified data of real world data, not controlled experiment data in learning sciences. So anyway, my brain goes into a million directions after that, not worth it.
What else? Karen, are you looking there?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm excited to find out how things progress within the cohort. I know we had a lot of newbies this particular cohort. A lot of people like, I better get on the xAPI train. I'm not sure what all this is. And I think as I go forward in having a hand in these cohorts, it'll be interesting to see the progression of people, because people don't just come for one cohort. They come, they build skills, they start with the little thing and they go bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's really exciting to see.
Matt, you want to go? What's something exciting?
I was listening to the answers and then I forgot the question. What was the question? What am I excited about?
Yeah, what's exciting in the xAPI space that you're interested in?
Amy mentioned it a little bit. The profiles. I think they've been around for pretty much as long as xAPI has been around, but I think it's just in the last few years that it's really started to grow in the tooling around it and people talking about it and people realizing a need for it. But I still don't think there's really been like a nexus of all those things. So I think that still needs some, because it's still hard to do a little bit, and you kind of need to work around how it all works. But I think it's going to be really important as people start to realize that things can get really wild really fast. So kind of reining that in a little bit. And also we were talking to somebody yesterday who had a need for something that was structured. They wanted to be able to just have something they could just pull out and say, this is how it's done. And having all these profiles set up where people say, okay, we've worked together to figure out the best way to do this. So here's an example, and you can just take that and run with it. So I think that's going to be an interesting space.
I know Andy Whitaker touched on profiles in his session with Ben, and a profile, for those of you who weren't in that session, a profile defines how we're going to talk about a certain type of learning, right? And so I think of SCORM as a very limited vocabulary. It's almost like the little kid chats, right? So you're in a social game, you're a little kid, you can only say like 6 things, and they're all nice and shallow. Like, hi, I like animals, right? I mean, they're like these very limited little things that you can say. And xAPI is more like the Lego store. I can go in and because it's a grammar, all I have to do is follow a grammar, and I can have these fantastic run-on sentences. I can say and do anything. But in order to make it all make sense and to be able to use that data in a meaningful way, right? Think about your LMS today. Because of SCORM, it doesn't matter if you build a course in Captivate or Storyline or Rise or Domino. your LMS reads it because they all send out SCORM, right? And then you could get a new LMS and all your old courses would work. You could fire all your vendors and hire instructional designer W-2s, and they would all be able to use each other's stuff because it would all go in your LMS, and nobody has to, right? Which is like it's SCORM. Nobody, well, most of us here, we don't have to worry about SCORM anymore. It just works, right? And so profiles will help us take this incredible explosion of possible data and organize them a little bit more so that we don't have to think quite so hard about how am I going, right? What is the verb that I use if somebody puts in a 5-star rating? Am I scoring it? Am I rating it? Am I giving it a 5, right? And like there's lots of different ways I can do that. So that's the quick version of profiles. Before we get totally nerdy into the detailed click level grammar of things, David, what's something in the xAPI space that you're interested in?
Well, yeah, and that's a good segue, because as much as the geeky side of me gets really excited about like how this is all happening, I'll answer it from a different perspective. Kind of my perspective of why I work for the Guild, why I love working for the Guild and the work that we do. I live for what I would refer to as the aha moments, when you can be at an event, someone's learning something, and you can see them connect the dots to what's being shared, to how they can use it, and they have that aha moment. You're providing a resource and they suddenly see the world differently. And when that happens, that's where innovation happens. That's where challenge happens. That's where problems get solved. And when we're hosting xAPI conversations, whether it be in the cohort, the party, sessions at our conferences, even articles that are on there, and someone has that moment where they connect the dots and they're like, oh, I can solve a problem with this that I haven't been able to solve in the past. That energizes me. That's why I get up. That's why I love the work that we do in the Guild. And you see that more and more as the case studies and the real practical solutions are being shared amongst the xAPI. People are having those aha moments, and that's what drives innovation. That's one of many reasons we do what we do here, is to help push the industry forward. So when we see those aha moments, we see people have that connecting of the dots. It just feeds me, and it really excites me about the future of where this tech is going to go.
I could not think of a better way to close this event, with aha moments. So thank you very much to David and Karen and the entire Guild producing team. There's Pam and Sierra behind the scenes today too. Thank you to all of our speakers, including Amy, but a whole set of speakers. Thank you, Matt. And thank you everyone for joining us today, for making this happen. And I hope to see you next semester, starting in February at the cohort. Maybe see you at Learning Solutions Conference, and then see you next spring for the next party. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Next cohort link is in chat, so please join us. Bye-bye, everyone.
Have a good one.